Well, then you can ask them, maybe, is there something like this? Jake, can you think of any negative consequences that this belief might have? You can, well, I think one thing is, that's why there's a number of them. What you can also do is to start asking questions, maybe to deal with this. For example, you can say, well, what does this mean to you? Or, what are the things are like this? Or, what causes this? In other words, if you're at a loss of words for what is initially said there, then you can either meta-model it, or you can start tracking it back further, or something like that. So in other words, till something does spring to mind. And that's a good question, and it's an important strategy to be able to have. Because if somebody says something and it doesn't give you groundwork with which to start from, you might want to have some ways of tracking it to other statements that give you more leverage or more flexibility. Is there any examples of things? Like, for example, what was there one that...
Well, someone in my group, two people in my group had seemed like being disorganized. so you gave him that one answer, and then it was like you didn't want to repeat the same thing. So there was one, and then the other person, that was the second thing. By the time it came down my turn to say something, it was like the third thing you could say. I'm like, okay, think quick. And I was running out of things to say.
It's just because you're disorganized. No. That's the problem. That's what it is. It's not that you couldn't think of something to say. It's just that you're so organized that... Right.
I was so organized I couldn't possibly imagine you not being organized.
Right. But see, that's another one. You could say it's not that you're disorganized. It's just that you're creative with your organization. Write that one down. Yeah, so I'm also curious. I know that, well, a lot of folks typically use NLP in therapeutic situations. I would really like to emphasize other kinds of things that come up in terms of, say, business issues or health issues or that kind of thing. So I'm also curious as to what kind of belief statements or beliefs came up, or did anybody have any around business, doing business, that kind of thing. I think certainly when you are working in a business context, you are going to be brushing up against beliefs in yourself and in other people all the time. And certainly one of the things that I have found in successful business people is that one thing that characterizes all of them is it's not that everybody shares a certain management style or even a particular organizational strategy. One thing they all share is that they believe in themselves and believe in what they're doing. And I think that probably is an important place to start. It's as important as any other thing that you could do in setting up a successful business. So I was curious if any came up around that. It could relate to success. It could relate to kind of things.
I could have one that if I desire something, then I usually get it.
Uh-huh.
And
so
if I meet somebody and I know that maybe way down the road that they could get me to other people or what have you, and I kind of logged it in the back of my mind, then something transpires, and I usually end up seeing them more often or what have you, that all of a sudden get what I ultimately want. If you need my help, let me know. If you need to get connected with finance or whatever, let me know.
That's an interesting, I think that's a good, interesting general belief. If I want something, I will eventually get it. That doesn't necessarily mean right now or tomorrow.
It just means that I take the steps to
Yeah.
And what I run into a lot is that success is not something that happens to you, it's something that you go out.
Uh-huh. So the limitation being that success is something that you have to make for yourself, or the limitation being that, well, success is something that just happens to you. I can see either one could create a problem. If you think I have to be a self-made success, and you don't let other people participate in that, or you don't let the environment around you determine some elements of that, then you could get yourself stuck. And on the other hand, if you say, well, success is just something that happens to me, so I don't have to participate in it, that on that environmental logical level that we were talking about could also be kind of a limitation. Does it happen both ways in the situations you deal with, or primarily in one way?
I would say the latter, in the type of business that we're in, they're generally comprised of people who go out and make things happen.
Uh-huh.
And the other kind, of course, is that life is not a lottery.
Yeah.
You don't just wait around.
So one thing would be, how would you go about then dealing with beliefs that where somebody would say, well, success is something that just happens to you, so I'm just sitting around and waiting, and I'm not going to be doing the things that could promote that. Yeah. Or people saying, well, I have to do something now because if I don't do it right away, then, if I don't personally, grab success by the shoulders and, bring it right to me, then I never have a chance of getting it. So one of the things you could do is, be interesting to see how could you go about sleight of mouthing, shall we say, those beliefs. And the question would be, and here's where I'd also like you to start thinking, what belief do you want to lead to? That's really the question. And before I know exactly how I want to sleight of mouth that, I have to know, well, what is the belief I want them to have? Because that's going to allow me to start to go from my problem belief to some kind of a more empowering, or you could say, could be more empowering, it could be stress reducing, whatever, but the desired belief. What would be an appropriate belief for people to have, for example, in your situation? Do you know what would be?
It strings along, because the thing that we run into at the end is that it's not even just this, it's a matter of then what is success, and success then becomes this, it's always one step further than where you are, and so I think then you have to ask yourself, well, then what is success and why is that success?
Yeah.
And I think then you might come back around to.
Yeah, so I hear you could do a lot of stuff there with redefinitions of success. So the belief changes, it would seem to me, would be around what's success, because you could say, well, it doesn't sound to me like you're talking about succeeding. It sounds to me like you're talking about comparing yourself to somebody else. That's not succeeding, that's comparing. And that could be. If somebody's always going, well, I always need to be one step ahead of myself. You could redefine it and saying that's not success. That's just trying to second guess yourself, which again could put it into a different frame for people to think about. Yeah.
I think it'd be a good idea to find a deep structure definition of what success is.
Well, that's an interesting thing. He says, because here, we might as well address this for a moment. We're bringing in the concept of deep structure. So deep structure, in a meta model, you have surface structure, and then there's a bunch of transitions. You finally get to deep structure. And whenever you're dealing with language, surface structure is typically the statement that somebody makes, which is not necessarily the deep meaning that it has. And one of the questions is, how do you track back to what the person really means, in the sense that this is the primary experience that stands for surface structure. What's interesting about sleight of mouth, though, and I think the typical way in which people look at language is they go, surface structure is generated from deep structure. Part of what we're saying is that there's a strange kind of a feedback loop here which says that, well, surface structure also affects deep structure. In fact, I was challenged, and I think quite nicely so and appropriately so, by somebody at the lunch break who said, well, now, Robert, you said that this chair, when we call this a chair, that's reality. And he said, that's not reality. That's still a belief about this. We were saying and I was saying it's quite true. And I want to bring this up for two reasons. One is because I think it relates to the deep structure, surface structure issue. Number two, because I want to encourage and reinforce that kind of thinking and that kind of challenging of presuppositions. Because in a way, the fact that we call this a chair is because we do all agree to categorize this as a particular object called a chair. I mean, we're agreeing that because this thing has these properties, we will decide to categorize it. We will believe that it's a chair and it has a certain function. Not everybody will do that, For example, I've noticed that in both the behavior of geniuses and of psychotics, certain things like that are challenged. You might very well indeed find somebody redefining this and saying, no, this isn't a chair, this is a spaceship, and actually believe it. And thus, they get a whole different set of experiences when they sit on this sucker, you know, and than you do, you know. I mean, I've seen people like that. So you could redefine this and say, no, this isn't a chair. That's what the whole structure of being a child and pretending is all about. Someone was talking about, there was a young man a couple of years ago when I was in this area, had a lot of problems with math, a lot of problems with fractions. And basically, I ended up with a sleight of mouth because I found out this young fellow could play chess exquisitely and was a wonderful cook and couldn't do fractions. You know, I thought, well, wait a minute. You know the difference between a half a cup and a quarter of a cup, don't you? Yeah, so I said, oh. So see, I don't want you to do fractions. These things are not fractions. They're just number recipes. This is an equation. It's just a recipe of numbers. Now that takes something that is supposedly a real thing in the outside world and it recategorizes it. So this guy went, oh, I see. All of a sudden, that made it very different. This isn't an equation, a mathematical equation. It's just a recipe in numbers. So again, that kind of thing where you take a fundamental presupposition like this is a chair and challenge it it can make somebody very creative. Now, of course, you have to balance that creativity with rapport with other people. But certainly that's one of the things that somebody like Albert Einstein did. Albert Einstein said, hey man, everybody has certain presuppositions about what time are. I don't agree with that. Everybody goes, well, of course things happen simultaneously. That's one of the things that Einstein did, is he challenged the whole concept of time because it was based on this presupposition that things can happen, two events can happen simultaneously. And he said, well, that's not really true. Things that we think are simultaneous are not really. So he took this very key, basic, presupposed concept in physics and challenged it and kind of turned around the whole field of physics. So what I want to say is, number one, here, by using, with this child, for example, by using a surface structure, by just going, well, this isn't this, it's that. We used a surface structure that had these incredible ramifications all the way down into a deep structure, which kind of changed the implication.
Okay, so what I meant is when you're challenging this, like the challenge success. One person in our group said, well, looking good is important. Okay, now looking good. Now we didn't challenge looking good, so we had our own idea of what looking good was.
Right.
And so we didn't find out all the information we wanted to. Because later on we found out that looking good to this person was their overall health and a lot of other things attached to it.
And isn't reality wonderful? This is the essence of all this stuff. We all have these different meanings for all these different things. And what he's saying is, I see that as being the kind of notion of pacing. In some ways, the fact that we have different definitions for looking good can really be valuable because it allows me that's what allows me to give this person a different perspective. Quite literally, it's because it means something different to me. I don't get caught in the same deep structure that person does. On the other hand, this is where I think this idea of pacing and leading comes in. Because pacing means that if my definition of this thing is so far away from that person's, if my sight, sounds, feelings that I use to understand that language is so distinct from that other person, I'm now not able to be close enough to their model of the world to pace it so I can lead it on. And on the other hand, if I'm too close to it and they go, well, if you look good, you have to give up something else. And I go, yeah, you're right. In other words, then I'm too close to it and I've gotten caught in their whole belief system. So that's the interesting thing, is there's got to be enough distance between your definition and theirs that you can get outside of it so you can move it. But you've also got to share enough. And I think what you're saying is that, in fact, some words are almost too general to be able to start right off with in terms of quote-unquote sleight of mouthing. So, and indeed, when you are working with somebody whether it's a conversation or whether it's an actual piece of work that you're doing with an individual, you want to make sure that you have enough information, that you're in enough rapport and you can pace them enough that you actually do share at least some basic images and feelings that they have associated with it. So here's where you get the pacing and leading issue. I'd like to say one last thing about the power of the word, so to speak. What I was intending when I was talking about the difference between this being a chair versus something being an identity, I was really talking about the notion of hierarchies, that if we say if this is a chair or not a chair, for the most part, that's about environment, which is the least impactful, typically, on a personal level. It's the least impactful part of our experience. So the fact that people call this a chair usually doesn't come up as a, I mean, people don't argue about it, and whether you call it a chair or you call it, I don't know. Yeah. Bar stool, right. It doesn't really make much difference. We go, so what? Okay, I can change the words. But when it comes down to my identity, if you say, well, Robert, you know, you're a manipulator or you're a charlatan, you know, I mean, one or the other, it doesn't make much difference. Now I got to go, wait a minute, you know, that's those words, you know, now you're talking things that are really important to me. Whether we, again, call this a chair or not a chair, doesn't make that much difference. And that's, now, by the way, and again, in certain situations, that might make quite a difference. And like I said, in the case of a person with psychosis, you know, you start going down, and one of the things that's so interesting about working with folks that are schizophrenic or something is that they don't share some of the real basic level presuppositions that you think everyone else does. You know, everybody talks about this is a good feeling and this is a bad feeling. This is pleasurable and this is painful. Everybody knows what that means. I mean, and that's where it really gets interesting and very, very powerful to work with the belief systems is on those levels, as well as the general identity levels. Also, in the context of something like art, I was reminded of something like Picasso. You know, you could take a bicycle and say, this is a bicycle seat, and this is bicycle handlebars, and Picasso would say, no, it isn't. It's actually a bull, you know. Here's the bull's head, and here's the handlebars, or, you know, So, in other words, by challenging basic presuppositions of perception, you also get down into some of those core things where you make certain beliefs based on primary relationships.
There are also some very common situations where describing it as a chair or a bar stool might be important in a non-therapeutic context. For instance, if you were writing a technical bulletin or a brochure for instruction, you might want to make a choice having to do with what you call it that's
Absolutely.
unrelated to a therapeutic situation.
Absolutely. Having been, I used to, when I was in college, I did a technical drawing and descriptions for water treatment plants. And you really realize when, if you're trying to tell somebody what something is over the telephone, you know, you can't show them, you know, it really gets interesting. Anyhow, I wanted to make a couple of those comments because I thought it was quite appropriate. In a sense, what it makes the work that we're doing here that much more profound to say that really everything, even our basic presuppositions about this is a microphone, is a belief. And therefore, the way in which we categorize and orient to those beliefs can make large impacts in a lot of different areas. How many people, I'd like to, I know right after lunch is a good time to be semi-active, so rather than talk to ears that are listening more to stomachs or things like that, rather have you be doing something so you can be active. How many folks, I'm assuming that most of you just got through one person and would need more time to finish. Okay. So, yes, you need more time. Okay. It looks like everybody needs more time. And in fact, lots more time. Well, actually, for some of the folks that were just coming in, I was starting, and maybe this would be another time just to check once more. What I'd like to do is to give you another, let's see, what time is it? Well, at least another half an hour to do this exercise that we started, where you do redefining and consequence in order to open up choices. Remember, open up choices, somebody else's belief. And I wanted to make sure, what it is I wanted to meet, just to touch bases before we went into that, was to find out if there were any big problems that you were having, or is it just a matter of just getting back in there and fiddling around? Right?
Gave me a real good idea with that chair. And my little boy says to me, I don't want to go to school. I say, no, that's not school. That's learning to drive a spaceship.
That's right. That's
But
right.
how could I refrain piano lessons?
Piano lessons. Oh, man. Piano lessons.
They're not lessons.
Let's go. Well, first of all, to reframe it, what we do is, that would be interesting, because this is really neat stuff. What about, what are the beliefs about it? What does person
He
speak?
was saying it was boring.
So piano lessons are boring. How does he know that? Does he say?
He seems to, I just noticed that his brother seems to be more excited about it. Since his brother got excited about it, he's not as excited about it.
So what you could do, there's a lot of different ways that I could say. You could say you're not learning to play the piano, you're learning to express yourself through music. What I'd want to do for him is to find out, here's where the pacing becomes important. I'd want to find out some kinds of criteria, values that are important to him, and then start to track it on over to that. Because there's a lot of different ways that we could talk about piano lessons. Piano lessons, for me, playing the piano was a way of developing dexterity in my fingers, which I could use for a lot of interesting things, which I could use for sports. So it's actually not playing the piano, it's exercising your fingers. It's learning to coordinate your hands. Also, here's where you also get into things like strategy. If you go to cause, what causes it to be boring? Well, typically, you're going to find there's things like the method that the person is trying to use to teach them. I'm kind of interested in this because I've just been doing a series of studies of geniuses, and Mozart is one of them. And Mozart had this incredible strategy where, music was connected to all these different feelings, and Mozart was able to see as an image, he even described it as an image, the whole composition that he was working on at one time. The sounds would go into this kind of an image, and he'd see it like a painting, not like a bunch of notes. He didn't have boring little notes. In fact, the way he described it is that he'd have this incredible synesthesia, and he'd see it's like this beautiful painting. And then since he could already see the painting, he'd just translate this into notes. He knew that this color meant this kind of sound, and so on and so forth. Remember another fellow we were working with, he had a strategy for learning to sight read the piano. If it's the sight reading that's the difficult part, where if you track back to cause, for instance, he said that when he was learning to play the piano, what he'd do is he'd see a note, a certain place on the scale, then he'd visualize in his mind's eye the piano keyboard, and he'd see which key went with that note, and he'd see another note, and he'd see, which key went with that note, and he'd see another one. Pretty soon what he could do is to look at the notes and he'd see the keyboard in his mind's eye. He could just sit around. Well, that was an interesting thing for him to do. So he said now when he plays music, when he sight reads music, it's real simple. It's like playing a player piano. He looks at the notes, sees the keys going down, and just sticks his fingers in the slots. So the question is, where's the trouble? Is the trouble learning to quote-unquote play the piano, or learning to visualize, have the piano play itself? The piano plays itself if you create the right image. And so there's a whole lot of interesting ways to do that. I think at this point, it would be interesting I'd like to come back to some of those kind of issues, just real basic day-to-day sorts of issues. Because what you're bringing up is also an issue about motivation, not just identity beliefs, but how could I code something in a way that motivates me, that makes me, like people that don't want to take medicine. He said that's not taking medicine, that's reminding yourself to be healthy. Well, I want to remind myself to be healthy. I don't want to take medicine. Those can become really interesting little changes that might actually, these amazing things that might actually make a difference for somebody that could really be important. Just one word, one little categorizing. So, without further ado, since I know words will make a difference here, I'd like to get you back involved in doing the... Yeah.
It's real hard.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good point to make, I think, too, because the purpose of this is not to have to think specifically, but it's to kind of train you about what happened, any issues, comments, if you did any things that you thought were really groovy, you know, or stuff like that. Where is he coming from, the 60s? Yeah, groovy, man. In other words, if there was just kind of what things came up, then I'd like to go on to introduce some more of the patterns and set up an interaction on a slightly different level. So, what kind of questions, comments, issues, revelations? Stuck places? Confusions?
We were doing some role playing here.
Uh-huh.
And there was a person playing the role of someone they were familiar with, and they kept getting resistance stuck and resistance. No matter what we said, it wasn't going to work.
Okay, can you give me an example? I'd be curious.
Let Pat do that.
Well, because I think that that's a real, I mean, that becomes an important issue. And, of course, with just two patterns, you might not be able to get around it. And number two, though, this is one of those situations where if somebody's talking about a belief and you're trying to change the belief and there's really an identity issue, that's, I mean, a so-called hidden agenda, if you will, then that can be real important to know about. And that's why I was saying it'd be good to have, getting that kind of example so you can go, oh, now I recognize what's going on there. Because if you're role-playing a client, what kind of thing was this? Is it possible to say what kind of belief did the client start with? Or?
I have been persecuted in past lifetimes, and that's why things are happening to me where they are now, why I'm not accepted.
Okay, so because of things happening in past lifetimes, because I was persecuted in past lifetimes, that's why I'm not being accepted now. Okay, so you could go to consequence and say, so then it's very important, the way that you are able to resolve those now will determine what's going to happen in your next lifetime. How would you like that to be? By the way, one other piece of context, of course, is I can take things and change around linguistically. Pat, where were you going with this person? What are they just is it just a conversation, or is this a person that, so it's this personal friend? Okay, where would you like to, in terms of doing the role play, I mean, from your point of view, where would you like to end up with the person? Just understanding it, or trying to lead them into a different, like, does it get in their way?
I feel that the persecution is getting in the way.
Okay. Okay, so they're saying, but the persecution isn't happening now, it happened in the...
Oh, yes, it's happening.
Oh, so persecution. Okay, so let's come back in, or we'll go back in. Well, is it persecution, or is it being tested for your next lifetime?
Well, karmically, I have to work through the persecution and the pain of having raped and being stabbed in the back, and I know that what my lack of acceptance here and the persecution still exists.
Well, is it lack of acceptance, or is it, again, is it other people that aren't accepting you into the groups? By the way, let's also take a step back, because this is a really interesting one, which is why I think getting the examples are good. Here you have, just like the paranoid person that I was demonstrating, here you have an individual who it's like a self-fulfilling loop. You have a belief that it's hard for other people to accept, so you're going to automatically have evidence to that. And here's a person saying, well, people don't accept me. They're not accepting my belief. So you try to challenge the belief, and what you're doing is you're falling right into that. Now this is also, I kind of like to use it as an opportunity to introduce another one of these patterns. And it's called a meta frame. And a meta frame, the interesting thing about a meta frame is that it is a belief that relates to your ongoing communication with the person. So what that means is, it's not just a belief, it's a belief that is about, it also includes what you're doing right here. So for me, I'm not just talking about you being accepted by other people. Whatever I do is an example of this belief as well. For instance, let's say somebody goes, well, since you do NLP, you're manipulating me. I mean, so, and you say, well, no, I wouldn't want to manipulate you. Well, of course you're going to say that you wouldn't want to manipulate me. That's a way of doing it. I mean, I've actually had people say, I feel so good, it makes me not trust it because, so, you're kind of saying, well, how do I, since I'm underneath this belief, how do I know you're not just pacing me? I feel like you're so genuine, it really scares me that people could act that way, because it might just be an act. I might really be getting fooled. The more sure I feel, the more I worry about that I'm just getting fooled by this. So these are the kind of statements that, like the paranoid statement, I want you to help me, but I don't trust you because you might be out to get me, or in this case, you might not be accepting me. And that's why I was saying that this is a good example of a meta frame because it relates to the ongoing context as well. And that's why you kind of have to put a meta frame on top of that as well. Where, and this would be an interesting thing to say, how could you outframe that frame? And I think that's, before you want to start redefining or going to consequences, because you can see that if I start redefining or going to a consequence, that will be perceived as unacceptance, which is why you're getting the resistance. And I think in this kind of a situation, the resistance is not coming from the belief or changing the belief. The resistance is about you and me right here, right now. What do I need to do to show you that I'm not out to get you or to challenge your belief or to not accept you? So what I'd want to do is to kind of try and find a frame that could go around that, which is to say, well, it could be something like, as a friend, I'm really concerned with this because maybe, I don't know how I fit into the acceptance or not, because I certainly would accept, I find that it's really easy for me to accept people, although because I'm limited in my own models of the world, it's not always easy for me to directly be able to pick up that model of the world. And then I might ask her, what she thinks about that. Because if she's a friend of mine, it's a really interesting thing to me, and I really am concerned about the feelings that she has. And because it's an interesting model of the world, and I would want to communicate with her about that. So what I would try to do, and again, I'd have to see how she responds, is set a frame where I validate acceptance, identity level, us being friends, and then push down confusion, not unacceptance. Say I'm not accepting your belief, I'm just confused by it. And I think a number of you were recognizing that a lot of times there begins to become an intention issue involved in this. My intention in doing this role play and not letting you win is because I'm trying to control it. I'm going to always find something that won't work simply because that is my purpose. My purpose is to be right. And sometimes that just has to be accepted. In other words, if you miss that, if you let that be the meta frame and you don't go above it, and this is where meta commenting becomes important. The way I get out of those kind of double binds is just to pull out of the situation and say, wait a minute, this content we're talking about doesn't seem to me to be the issue. It seems to me like you have a real need to be in charge of what's going on here, and I don't want to challenge that.
This person believes that they're really brighter than the average, and therefore...
That's right. So if they give in, imagine then if... Yeah. Yeah. So then that's what you want to do, though, is to go above that. I won't call the person on that if there's something that's being hidden there. And this is, by the way, where also another outcome, which is another sleight of mouth pattern, becomes important. For instance, I was once in a group where people were trying to elicit a decision strategy from a woman who didn't believe she could make good decisions. And so they were trying to have her get an example where they could get a good decision so they could help her change her decisions. And she said, well, I've never made a good decision. They said, well, did you ever buy a car? Yeah, but it was a lemon. Well, did you ever get rid of it? Did you decide to get rid of it? Oh, yeah, I had to get rid of it. Well, wasn't that a good decision? Well, no, that wasn't a decision. That was just paying for my mistake. So any good decision, she recategorized as something else. So when I came in, I first put a metaframe where I said, well, you know, the first thing I wonder about, if your decision strategy is so bad, how do we know that it's a good decision to change it, you know, if you've decided that it's not good? And then when they told me all the things, I said, oh, well, I see. The issue here now is not about making decisions. So I mean, what I did is I just said, that's not the outcome. The outcome is really something different, which is how to determine what the situation is leading to. I mean, I just made up something like, instead of making a decision about what to do, how to figure out what the situation was going to lead to ahead of time, so that you know, so it's like, it's not making decisions, it's learning from mistakes or something like that. And she didn't have all the confusion because she was obviously in all this double binds about decisions and good decisions and bad decisions. And so we just said, oh, that's not even the issue. It's learning from your mistakes. It's about learning, not decision making. Well, it was amazing, you know. The person went right along with it. So that's another modality where you have, so another outcome is number 7 on the definition list. Another outcome involves challenging the relevancy of the belief and switching to another issue altogether. So I say, this issue isn't about past lives. This issue is about who's intelligent or not. Call it, I mean, so you jump up a level. You say, you don't try to challenge the belief itself. In fact, you say, oh, this belief actually seems to me to be irrelevant to what we're talking about. This is the issue. Actually, I was talking with somebody during the break today. We were saying, well, I have trouble getting my daughter to want to go to school. And we actually discovered that really the issue wasn't about getting her to want to go to school. It was about them communicating in general. And that's where that magic of jumping up the level and saying, wait a minute, this isn't a belief issue, this is an identity issue, or this isn't about what you're capable of, this is about what you believe. That can make life so much easier for you so that you're not banging your head against the wall. I'll give you a real simple example. I developed this NLP spelling strategy thing that people use a lot, and it's a very powerful strategy. However, you run into the same issue here. If I teach a kid to spell a word frontwards and backwards, does that mean that they know how to spell yet? No, they just spelled a word frontwards and backwards. What do I have to do to get them to realize, oh, I'm capable of spelling? I've learned how to learn. Now, even if somebody's capable of spelling, then you get the other belief issues and identity issues. For example, I remember working with a fellow who actually has been a couple times that this comes up. One was in Atlanta with a person who was having all kinds of trouble trying to visualize the words. And what you find is it wasn't about could he visualize the words or spell. In fact, this person who was a very successful businessman but couldn't spell.
Very successful.
Yeah. What happened was he had a picture up there of his third-grade teacher. And it basically, the belief was something akin to, if I finally learn to spell after all these years, I'll finally be giving in to that son of a bitch that I vowed I'd never give into. That's called beliefs and identities. That's not about spelling. Remember somebody, you know, I had him spelling frontwards and backwards, and he goes, oh, well, yes, now I know that I can spell, but I'd really rather not become a stiff and sensitive person. What does that have to do with spelling, you know? And it turns out, you know, again, 4th grade teacher, again, person that was his model for what a good speller was this individual who was normally a nice guy, except when it came to spelling, and then he became very rigid and insensitive to the feelings of this 4th grader, who the person was now in his 30s, but he had equated somehow that spelling must have been what made this person do that. And so here's where you get, you know, you can bang your head against the wall for a long time trying to force somebody to violate their own personal integrity by learning to spell. Or you can go, wait a minute, let's jump a couple levels here and check identity issues. The same thing with the sleight of mouth. When you find yourself going around in circles and the person is not responding, that can also be a tip-off. There's another agenda here, and that agenda might be on a higher level. And I think that that's the place I would go with this person. I'd drop the whole issue about past lives and persecution at this point and go to identity. I remember Joe Yeager, a person that we know who's very good intuitively with sleight of mouth. He once had a person who believed that he was being persecuted. He worked in a particular warehouse. And for example, he knew that people lined up the boxes so that all the lines, there were lines on the boxes, they all pointed at him, it was very, talk about reality and things, So these lines, he knew, all the lines pointed at him, so he was being persecuted. And Joe came to him and said, I thought you were a religious person. Out of the blue. I said, I am, what are you talking about? He says, well, didn't you ever read Job? He says, yeah. He says, what does that have to do with this? He says, well, how do you know that you're not just being tested by God? Like Job was, to test your own faith. That people are doing this, and, if they're setting this up, how are you going to deal with it? How should you deal with this fact that people are persecuting you? Should you be mad at it and fight against it and angry about it? Or should you learn something from it, accept it, and go to a higher level in your own response to it? So, and it was really interesting. He said he turned out just by pacing and leading this and reframing it as being not persecution, but the person was being tested. How would God want you to react? Would he want you to be paranoid about it? Or would he want you to be forgiving and understanding about it? And he said that completely changed around this person's response. And of course, once he started responding differently to the people in his environment, they started responding more differently to him too, and set up a positively reinforcing loop. And the guy, eventually, all the problems disappeared. So again, these levels, if one thing you can understand about sleight of mouth and human behavior is these logical levels can really make a difference. If you get stuck on one level, shift, go to another one. Good point, good issues. And I guess, again, what I would do in that situation is I'd step back, comment on the relationship itself. Say, this is what seems to me. I feel unaccepted by what you just said. Sort of. Let's also come back to that one as we introduce some of the other patterns. Any other interesting things? Yeah.
You just brought up one, this feels so good, I'm suspicious of it.
Right.
How do you respond to that?
Well, here, of course, what you want to do is, in this case, you might want to get some of the rest of the belief statement. What would happen? What makes you suspicious? Is it that feeling good is going to cause something bad to happen? Is it that feeling good, every time I feel good, I'm fooled by it? That I can't trust my own feelings. So what I'd want to do is to first fill out the rest of the belief. What makes you suspicious about feeling good? Because they might say, well, because every time I feel good, something bad happens afterwards. Or they can say, because, what? sorry, yeah. Second thing is, I can say, I could reframe any number of things. I could say, well, are you being suspicious or just thinking realistically about it? So if we're going to be thinking realistically about it, let's think realistically about it. If I reframe suspicion of a good feeling to, of course, that's a realistic thing to do because good feelings don't always last. They can't hide other things. But what it does is it takes it out of suspicion and starts putting it into, quote-unquote, realistic thinking, which is, well, what could happen here? What do good feelings indicate? How can I deal with that? I could also redefine good feelings. Is it good feelings that you're having as opposed to good thoughts? You have good feelings, but it sounds to me like your thoughts aren't good. Otherwise, you wouldn't be suspicious. So maybe what we need to do is to get your good feelings and your thoughts to coordinate together. Now, what that does is it puts another frame around it that, again, can open up possibilities. Because obviously, in a situation like that, the person's in a conflict. If you feel good, how can you really be suspicious of it? If it was generalizing to all the other sensory modalities. So I feel good, but my internal dialogue is not going along with this. And then I separate out good feelings and say, now let's deal just with the internal dialogue. So what that does, it kind of takes it out of just this general belief issue. Also, in some of these, in the responses that I'm making, I'm starting to use other types of sleight of mouth maneuvers, which I think might be good to sort of go into right now. Because what I'd like to do for the next one is to have you set up a little bit different situation than me working one-on-one with somebody. Somebody plays a belief to me, and I have to create options in it. There's another form of sleight of mouth I think is very important, and that is resolving conflicts, whether it's in yourself or between two people. People have conflicting beliefs, and those beliefs will, cause them to go into either polarity responses to one another or just cause a lot of resistance and stress. And one of your jobs, whether you're, again, business, therapy, health, whatever, is often to resolve conflicts. And whether it be internal conflicts of beliefs inside of one person in a health issue where they go, yes, I think I can get better, and no, I don't deserve to get better. Or whether it's a conflict in business where you've got to negotiate between two people who are fighting amongst each other. That being able to use sleight of mouth to set verbal frames to resolve conflicts is as important as stretching beliefs or creating more options in beliefs. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to present 4 new patterns, and what we're going to do is get into groups of 3s. 2 people are going to go outside and each going to take 2 of these 4 patterns each, and you're going to go set up a role play in which you will be in conflict with one another based on these patterns. And a role play can be anything that you choose. Then I'm going to have the 3rd person who's staying in here, I'm going to have you stay in, and I'm going to teach you 2 other patterns. And your job is then going to be to resolve the conflict between the other people verbally, trying to use sleight of mouth. We'll be doing other things, but using sleight of mouth as a way to set beliefs so that these people can resolve their problem. They won't know which 2 you're going to be using. But I think you'll find that to be interesting, is how sleight of mouth patterns weave together. So if somebody puts a consequence on you and your belief, what do you do to sort of counteract that? And where do you want to go with it? Do you want to just win an argument, or do you want to actually bring something to an appropriate resolution? So here's what we'll do. Let me teach the patterns, and then we'll get into the groups. So here's the first 4. One is going to be chunking down, the other will be chunking up. One's going to be counterexample, and then changing frame size. One meta comment about the whole process, by the way. I like to state these things sometimes because I think they're important. One, we're learning this in a structured way. I'm giving you a structure for how to think about language. When you actually use this, like when I'm responding to people's beliefs, I don't necessarily think about it from the structure. The structure builds an intuition in me, and I respond from the intuition. So one of the things I want you to realize is that when you use this to make a difference between the structure of, the reason I'm teaching it to you in structure is to build an intuition, so that when you're actually talking to somebody, you don't necessarily need to respond from the structure, which will add another whole thought process in there. You can respond from the intuition that has been built by the structure. So if, in case you're thinking, oh God, I have to think about all the things I'm saying and know if it's going to be a redefine or not, when you're actually using this in real life, you don't necessarily have to think about it that way. Knowing the structure can help you to come up with certain ideas. If you get stuck intuitively, if you can't intuitively figure out where to go, you can then rely on the structure. But my primary reason for teaching you the structure is not so that you respond logically and structurally, but so you build intuitions that will make this stuff pop out of your mouth and go, whoa, that's kind of interesting, I just did that. Okay. Secondly, sleight of mouth is very verbal. It by nature is words, so I know some of you, when we get into language and words, the way of demonstrating it is with more words, because it's a very verbal thing. So I wanted to let you know, I acknowledge that, and I know that sometimes it'll seem like words are spewing out of your ears and your nose and your mouth and stuff. And if if there's times when we need to just sort of take a break or something, you might want to let me know and we can do something physical. I think what we'll do is after I do these next patterns, we'll do something as an intermediate, sort of a physical thing. So, chunk down, chunk up. Let me mention, we skipped over intention. Intention is something that I think most NLP people already have a lot of experience with. Intention is basically where you go to not the consequence of the belief, but what is its intended purpose? What is this belief trying to accomplish for the individual? For example, if we take a persecution belief, the intention might be, I build this belief system that nobody can challenge because I want to show how smart I am. That's an intention. It's not necessarily a consequence. It's not a redefine, but it has this kind of positive intention. A lot of times people have beliefs and even psychoses because it's a way of making them special. The only way that I can really be special is by doing this thing that nobody else can challenge or understand or deal with. So I'm special. If I start responding to you, if I start following along with what you want me to do, then I'm not special anymore. So sometimes this, people especially have had a problem for a long, long time. There becomes this quality of specialness, this intention of uniqueness. So think about that as a possible frame to go to in terms of, it's the standard NLP reframe. What is the intention behind this behavior, behind this belief? So I just want to mention that one. I think you'll probably be familiar with it, and you're certainly welcome to use it. Chunking down. When I chunk down, I'm going to be breaking the elements of this belief up into small enough pieces that it actually changes the relationship that is defined by the belief. So for example, if somebody goes, saying mean things means you're a mean person, and you say, well, which syllable had the most meanness in it, so that I know which ones to change? Yeah, I mean, that's your response. It's like, well, that's silly. It doesn't work that way. If I chunk it down small enough, it doesn't fit anymore. The relationship can't hold if I break it down into intonation patterns, syllables, letters. I can't make it work that way. So that's what chunking down does. It allows you to, you take the basic relationship, and if you break it into small enough pieces, the relationship doesn't hold. It's like saying, if I say Xerox is a big company, it doesn't mean that all the people that are working in Xerox are big people. I mean, the relationship doesn't hold. Hold for the company, doesn't hold for the people. If I say, the United States is the richest country in the world, it doesn't mean that because you're from the United States, you must be a rich person. What holds for the group doesn't hold for the individual. And that is a maneuver that you can take with sleight of mouth, again, to cause people to rethink the relationship that they've defined. Chunking up is going the other direction. I take the elements and I generalize them to a larger classification so it doesn't hold anymore. So if I take mean things and I generalize it, it could be communicating emotionally. I mean, so saying a mean thing is communicating emotionally. That's a much bigger chunk. And I might say, well, does emotional communication make me a bad person? Well, no, the relationship doesn't hold anymore if I generalize it to a big enough classification. So chunking down is breaking it down, chunking up is generalizing it bigger. Some people typically chunk things down. A very classical kind of thing that you find in, I see this happening a lot between, say, executives and accountants. The executive comes in and they go, well, how is the company doing? And the accountant says, well, let's see, last week we made this much money, and then of course on this we had this much sales, but then we had to subtract this and this. Because I don't want to know that. I want to know how the company's doing. I'm telling you, last week we did this. This happened. Because the accountant's job is to chunk down, and the other person's trying to get the big chunk. He wants the general elements, and the other person's giving him the specific pieces. So when you think about having conflicts, you can often find that people get into a conflict because one person is looking at it from the big picture, the other person is looking at it from the immediate small details. Think about classic addictive behaviors. I need this because it's going to make me feel good in the short term, but in the long term the big picture, I won't feel good about myself. So which one do I do? If I give in and I don't have this drink now, then I'm going to feel bad. But if I do have the drink in the longer term, I'm going to feel bad. It's a matter of chunking. So chunking up, chunking down will change the implication of a belief. Let's go through some of the examples sort of quickly to build the intuition about it. I can't do X because I've never done it before. Chunking down would be to say, how many minutes or incidents of not doing something creates how much incapability?
Creates what?
How much incapability? This person says, I can't do it because I haven't done it before. Well, how many minutes of not doing it is worth how much capability? Well, it doesn't break down minute by minute or element by element that way. The person can only perceive it in the general. If I was going to chunk up, I could take not having done it before and say, well, that's just a member of a class of not getting successful feedback. So I generalize not doing it to not getting successful feedback. It's a bigger chunk. So I go, is lack of successful feedback always proof of impossibility? I take I can't do something and generalize it to impossible. So again, on that level, the person will say, no, I guess lack of successful feedback doesn't always prove that something's impossible. And so what I've done is to generalize their belief statement to a point that they kind of have to challenge it themselves. If I go, if I care about others, they'll take advantage of me, and I want to chunk that down, I can say, well, if you only partially care about somebody else, which part of you do they take advantage of? And it's like, well, it doesn't quite hold that way. I mean, or again, you'll notice it starts to cause you to think about the whole relationship differently. I can chunk it up. Do people always get hurt when they feel for others? Getting hurt is a bigger class of being taken advantage of, and feeling for others is a bigger class of caring for others, because there's a lot of other feelings. So what I do is I generalize that statement to incorporate even more things and see, does it still hold if I generalize it this much? If we go to, you were late, so you don't care about me. Chunk it down. How much caring was each second worth? You know. So again, yeah, right. You gotta watch the report on that one. Or is the most basic aspect of our relationship just a matter of time? So caring, basic aspect of relationship, late, matters of time. Again, well, it doesn't quite seem the same when you put it that way. You say mean things, so you're a bad person. We were kind of doing that one already. Which syllable that I used had the most bad in it? Chunking up. Do you think that everyone who gets a little irritated is evil? Again, chunking up bad to evil, chunking up mean things to irritated, being irritated. This house is too expensive. I can't afford it. Which parts of it could you afford? You know. How about the door? Can you get that window? We got about half of it that you can afford now. We can borrow the rest, and you know. So, I mean, that's by the way, it's a strategy. You'll recognize that they do that, don't they? This, chunking it up, and instead of this house, I go to property, and instead of not being able to afford, I go to big investment. So property is a big investment. I'm chunking it up to bigger categories. Cancer causes death. If I'm going to chunk it down, what degree of death does each cancer cell cause? One cell causes one element of death. Of course, the relationship doesn't work that way. It's about thresholds. Cancer causes death. Chunking it up. Cancer is a mutation or a change in a part of a system. Death is the destruction of that entire system. So I chunk up and say, does a change in a small part of the system automatically cause a destruction in the whole system? Not necessarily. There must be other elements that are involved that determine what destroys a system or not. So again, here we see how these chunking up and chunking down, again, the goal of it is not necessarily, if you're working with somebody, is not necessarily to beat them or change their belief. It's to start getting them to think about it. Now, when you do the role plays, I'm going to assign one person to be a down chunker, one person's going to be an up chunker. so to speak. So you'll see how those things work together in an argument, because it'll be real interesting, I think, just to even do it, to find out how you take somebody's statements and keep chunking it down, and the other of you're going to try and keep going to the bigger elements. Okay? So, yeah, up chunking. So anyway. Now, the other two patterns. One is going to be counterexample, and one is going to be change frame size. Counterexamples. Let's go to the definition page first. Counterexample is finding an example of something that doesn't fit the relationship defined by the belief. So in other words, a typical structure of a counterexample is if somebody says, I'm a poor learner because I've never done well on tests, if I can find a test that they've done well on, that becomes a counterexample to their belief statement. If I can find very intelligent people like Einstein who did poorly on tests as well, who clearly wasn't learning disabled, that becomes a counterexample, which forces you to have to rethink about your belief. So we'll go over let's go over counterexamples as a single category. Let's go to page 1. I can't do this because I've never done it before. One creative way to respond to that would be something like, can you repeat what you just said 20 times as fast and loud as you can? You've never done that before. So again, the counterexample being, here is something that you could do. There's also a little double bind in there. This is something that you could do that you haven't done before. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do things you haven't done before. There was a time when you were an infant and you couldn't even understand statements like you just made to me. Since you've done that before, can you do that right now? You know? In other words, can you not understand what you just said? I mean, that would be, again, an interesting double bind, but it does use a counterexample. Since you've done it before, why not? You can do it. If I care about others, then they'll take advantage of me. Counterexample. Isn't it possible to care about others and take advantage of what they have to offer? So again, I can do this and take advantage there. It doesn't only have to go one way. Counterexample. Most people take advantage of people who could care less. You know, again, it's another form of a counterexample. So again, I can have one without the other. I can find an example that doesn't fit the belief statement. You were late, so you don't care about me. I know a lot of people who are punctual but unfaithful. Well, caring people are often late because they care so much about what they do. So again, counterexamples that say, well, late doesn't always have to do with caring. You say mean things, so you're a bad person. I know a lot of people who say nice things, but they'll turn around and stab you in the back. Again, it's a counterexample. Every good person has probably said something mean at some time or another, so good people can say mean things, counterexample. And you can always go and find examples of that and people who are really good. This house is too expensive, I can't afford it. There are a lot of ways to make expensive things affordable. And of course, many affordable things turn out to be expensive in the long run. You know, getting the cheapest one could end up buying a headache. So what do you care about? Your well-being or how much money you're paying? So again, counterexamples. Cancer causes death. Number one, there are many reports of people who've had cancer and are in remission. By the way, this is an interesting thing about language. Let me digress just for a second, because I was just reading a thing where a person went out to study cancer remissions. And he went to a hospital, and he asked for their data, went to actually a local hospital where I live, near where I live in San Francisco, and he asked for their data on cancer remissions. And they said, we don't have any. And so he looked around, and of course the reason they didn't have any data on cancer remissions is because they don't have a category for it. I mean, in the hospital, you know, people, if they die, you have all the statistics on the ones that die, but if they don't come back in, they get better, you don't, you know, they're just not a terminal case. You know, you don't know what happens to them. And so they didn't have a category for cancer remissions, therefore there was no information on it. They don't exist to the hospital. And so he said, I tried to figure out, well, how will I find cancer remissions? He says, well, can you give me all the information on people that were diagnosed as having terminal cancer and weren't reported as being terminal? I mean, that they didn't have you don't have the data on them being terminal. And he found there's like 180 people in the last 5 years or something that fit this category. So then he went out and he started to check up on them. Well, maybe a couple, 3 of them had moved out of the area. Another 4 or 5 of them had gone to a different hospital and died. But there was like 170 people or so that, were still doing just fine 5 years later or so after a diagnosis. And he went and asked some questions and started to study them and came with some real interesting data. But my point is, you start thinking about, again, the power of language and the power of categories. Hospitals don't have information on cancer remissions just literally because there is no category for it. How can you get data on something you don't have a name for? What's that?
Pharmaceutical companies don't pay for this.
That's right. Well, that's right. Well, then there's consequences and intentions we could get into. But my point is, I think it's so interesting about reality is that if there's no way of defining it, then they don't carry the information. It's why, that kind of thing is not factored into a typical medical observation. I had another interesting example of it. I was recently in Holland, and there was an issue there that some women brought up they wanted to work with in terms of beliefs about women, much more, I think it's more so in Europe. I'm sure it's an issue here, but I think it's more so in Europe than in the States. Women being leaders in a group. And they had so we were working on this issue of what beliefs that would you need and what beliefs limited women from being able to be comfortable in a leadership role. Well, what we found was that there were a number of women, it's rather interesting. There's one woman who even trained people how to do it. But she didn't have anything to say to these people that had this issue because for her, leadership didn't have to do with being a woman, it had to do with being a leader. Therefore, there was never any feedback of information to women in a leadership role because for these people, it didn't have anything to do with being a woman. So they defined themselves right out of a feedback loop. And some of the women that were concerned about being in the leadership realized that they would group together with other women, who weren't in leadership roles, and so becoming a leader would then ostracize them from the group, and it created this real interesting double bind. But basically, it was kind of interesting because the information that they wanted to get, other people in the room had that they'd been in this group the whole time, but they never connected it because they defined it as being an issue that related to something else, not as relating to a woman, it was relating to being a leader. So these are some of the kind of interesting things about labels and about beliefs. So I just wanted to digress on that for a moment because it does illustrate some of the power of how language can actually keep feedback loops from occurring so information never gets transferred. Because a person goes, it doesn't belong in that category. Leadership is not a woman's issue, so why should I tell women who think it's an issue anything about it? That's what was happening. So anyway, counterexamples, coming back now, have to do with finding examples that don't fit the belief. Last one for us before we take a breather here, and that is change frame size. Now, one of the people in the group, if they're going to set up the conflict situation, one of you is going to chunk down and do counterexamples. The other one is going to chunk up and change frame size. And that you'll see these two things kind of go together. Change frame size has to do with, let's go start with the definition here. Change frame size is with reevaluating the implication of a belief in the context of a longer or shorter time frame, or larger or number of people, or from an individual viewpoint, or from literally a bigger or smaller perspective. When I was giving the Bandler example of saying, well, what good is it going to do to move this thing out of my way? The person will just do something else. I was going to an immediate time frame. If you said, okay, well, let's go and talk to the person and find out what their intention is and why they're persecuting you, I go, great, a lot of good that's going to do. Here's where I go to the immediate time frame. I say, a lot of good that's going to do because I've got this thing I'm going to trip over now, and you're talking about taking care of something in the future, and my life's in immediate danger. So you go, all right, well, let's deal with the immediate danger. Well, what good is that going to do? They're just going to do something else in the long run. Well, let's deal with what they're going to do in the long run. Hey, well, that's not going to help because look what's happening in the immediate present. And whatever frame the people were going to, he would come to the opposite. So if they went over a longer time period, he would come to immediate danger. They say, well, let's deal with the immediate danger. He'd say, yeah, but that's not going to help in the long run. So again, what you see is he just was shifting the frame, going into a larger or smaller time frame, so people didn't know how to, they couldn't respond to it. One of the best ways that I know of to think about changing frame size is what happens in movies, quite literally. Changing frame size is something that's done, for example, by people like Alfred Hitchcock to create suspense. I go into an individual's frame. So I remember in one of these things, he shows two people talking together. And when you're real close to them, they're talking together and having a nice conversation. Then he goes and he shows a bigger frame, and there's a bomb under the table that they don't see. You know. Then he goes back up and they're talking again, and you're going, oh, you know, there's a bomb going on, and there's a suspense building because in one frame, you're not noticing that there's a danger that you see in a bigger frame. So I mean, that's literally physically changing a frame size in a movie. Another good one is from the movie Cabaret. How many people saw Cabaret? There's one scene in the movie where it shows a young blonde kid, and he's singing in this tenor, you know, voice, very pretty song. And they start panning back. You sort of get a feeling it's kind of a nice thing. They start panning back, and you see that this kid's wearing a Nazi uniform. So it kind of literally changes your perspective on what's happening. Then they go back even farther, and not only is he wearing a Nazi uniform, he's singing in front of a big Nazi rally. And it just literally takes this frame and puts it under a completely different point of view, which totally changes the implications of what's going on from the first perspective. So changing frame size has to do with literally perspective. That's different, by the way, than chunking up. You're not generalizing to bigger categories. You're keeping the belief the same. You're just saying, well, how does it look if I take a big time frame? How does it look if I take a little time frame? Let's go over the examples, and we'll take a breather. So, change frame size on I can't do X because I've never done it before. I say, in the long run, if people didn't start with that belief, we'd all end up being confident without being competent. So what I do is I kind of put their belief, which they're kind of saying is limiting, in a bigger time frame where I say, well, it's good that you have that belief to start with, because you don't want to believe that you can do something and not be able to be competent in it. So I put it into a bigger perspective. By the way, putting it into a bigger perspective, then you'll notice it also frames it as being a start as opposed to the end. So putting in a bigger perspective allows me to perceive this as being the beginning of a process, not the end of a process. By the way, well, there's other things that we can do, but I think they come up in some of the other things. Yeah, pacing and leading. Remember, all sleight of mouth things are going to work best if you pace first. If you present it as a challenge, it'll be perceived as a challenge. If you pace and lead with it, it will shift someone's perspective. That's your goal. Change frame size on, if I cared about others, they'll take advantage of me. Well, you don't care long enough to find out what the advantages of caring are. So again, maybe if you cared over a long enough time, it would turn around the other way. Or, if everyone thought that way, who'd care? So I take number of people. This is not chunking up, notice. I'm not chunking up caring to being concerned with people's feelings. I'm saying if enough people had that, or if you had it over a long enough time, it would change its implication. You were late, so you don't care about me. Better late than never. So, putting it in a bigger frame. Or you can say, well, in the larger scope of our relationship, a few minutes is just a grain of sand. So, you know, perceiving it from a bigger picture, different frame size. You say mean things, so you're a bad person. It may seem bad now, but in the long run, it's going to be better off for them. Again, bigger time frame. This house is too expensive, I can't afford it. It may seem like a lot now, but when you compare it to what it will be worth 10 years, in 10 years, it's a steal. So again, I change the frame. If I compare its cost over a larger level time, well, it doesn't seem so bad. Cancer causes death. Is that a belief that you'd like your daughter to have? And that's an interesting thing of putting it into a very immediate frame. And you can do that, again, that's one that's really interesting to do with a lot of these. It's to say, somebody says, well, I can't do this because I've never done it before. You can say, well, is that the belief that you want to pass on to your children? Well, all of a sudden it puts that belief into a very different framework. The other way of changing frame size on this is, instead of going to an immediate small individual level, I can go to a general level and say, well, if everybody had that belief, we'd never find the cure for it. So again, putting it into a different frame. Now, what I'd like to have you do for a moment is to clear your minds, clear your bodies, and we're going to take a break here. And what I'd like to do is, before I do any talking about setting the assignment up or anything, is to allow you to do something that has nothing to do with language or logic. For the next, we're going to just take a break. And during that break, though, what I'd like to kind of have you do is to go outside, or out in the lobby or something. What I'd like you to do is just to pay attention to something that is, go out and notice at least 3 things in each of your senses that is other than verbal and that is pleasant. So for example, your task would be just to go out and see things that don't have anything to do with language, of just connecting with sensory experience. Notice, for example, maybe the way that the sun casts a shadow somewhere that pleases you. Go out and listen for something, and just doesn't have anything to do with words, but maybe birds or just the noise of a group down the hall that kind of sounds like people. Yes. Or maybe just your own breathing. And then feel things that have nothing to do with words or logic or anything, but maybe just notice the way that your feet touch the ground, or notice how when you walk outside the door the temperature shifts in a unique or a more comforting way. So all you have to do is to be not verbal, which means tune your senses to something, especially something that's kind of pleasurable for you. And be back in, what do you think you need so that all the cobwebs are gone? 10 minutes? One of the things I thought I'd do is I made some little visual representations up here that I'll explain and relate to the sleight of mouth. But I think that sometimes just having a little picture of things can help you to, especially something that's so verbal, can help you to get at least a metaphor for it. So one of the things that, let's go over the chunk down and chunk up first. In the chunk down, what you have in these pictures are, a person goes, this house is too expensive. So I'm showing, here's the first part, there's a house and there's all this money. When you chunk it down, you say, well, the tree's only this much money, and the door's only that much money, and the window's only that much money. When you perceive it in smaller pieces, it becomes different. I remember a good example from a guy who was, he used to sell people pots and pans, aluminum ware. He's one of these real famous salespeople. And what you had to do was you had to buy this whole set, and he'd go around and try and sell these sets of aluminum ware to people. And a lot of times he'd get objection. It was during the Depression. He'd get objections, and people go, oh, that's too expensive. And one of the things that he used to do is he'd say, do you go out to eat? The person would say, yeah, lunch. He said, well, do you leave a tip for the waitress? Cleans up your dishes, yeah. How much do you leave? Quarter? Okay. Does your wife clean up for you after, just make your meals and clean up for you afterwards? After you eat? Yeah. Do you ever leave her a tip? Well, he says, well, imagine, how long would it take you to pay for this if you just left her a quarter tip for every meal? Well, in other words, you can see that the progression would be, by chunking it down into smaller pieces like that, he put it into a framework where the person said, yeah, I guess that this could be affordable. If I put a quarter aside for every meal I got, that's not very much money. But if you take enough breakfasts and dinners and things like that, that can add up to some money, fairly quickly. So that would be another example of how chunking down could kind of change a person's perception of it. Probably one of the best examples I know of this was from Milton Erickson, actually. A guy we all know. And Milton had a lady who came to him, who had been trying to learn to read for 50 years without success. And what he found was, I mean, this woman had been so anxious to read that she used to board all the local school teachers. And she would board them for free in exchange for them trying to tutor her in reading. Now we're talking, he did this 50 years, and at the time she met Erickson, she had 3 teachers boarding at her house, and no one was getting anywhere. And they all kind of described the same thing, that she would go, they'd start to teach her to read, and she'd just kind of blank out and freeze up. And then she'd just kind of be spaced out for this whole time. Now, she said, oh, I want to read so much, I want to do this, Dr. Erickson, can you please help me? Can you use hypnosis? Something like that. And he thought about it for a while, and he did 2 things that were extremely significant. First one was pacing. And what he did was, he said to her, well, I think I can teach you to read, but you have to do everything that I tell you to do, so long as you can already do it. And she kind of looked confused for a moment. Because what he said was, you have to follow exactly everything I tell you to do, as long as you can already do it. So notice this is kind of an interesting thing, she's agreeing to something, she doesn't know exactly what he's talking about, but it's kind of interesting. So then what he does is he gives her a pencil. And he says, you can hold this pencil in your hand. Yeah, a baby can hold a pencil, so you can hold a pencil. That's something you can already do. Now take this pencil and poke it at this paper. I mean, a baby can do that, and now make a line like this and a circle like that, and he just had to start making, a baby could make marks on a piece of paper, making marks. And, he has her get some like this and some like that, and, finally kind of works around various elements that would have to go together to make an alphabet. Then he has her go home that night, and she has to practice that, for at least 2 hours that night, just practice making marks. She makes marks. The next day she comes in, and he has her start just making marks by each other. So make a mark here, and then make one of these rounded ones there, and then just a mark like this there, and maybe one like that, and one like that. He's just having her make marks until she can do it. She's just making marks. Just combining them together, but a baby could do that, and she could already make them, so just put them next to each other. That's easy enough. Great. She goes home and he has her practice just these particular ones, just making these little sets of marks. And then he instructs her for the next day, she's to come in and bring some stuff that she wants to read. Okay. The next day she comes in. He goes. The first thing he starts off with, he says, this is a floor plan for a barn that's 20 feet by 40 feet, because she was a rural person. Okay, so she was kind of a down-home type person and had always worked on the farm, never had any education. So he goes, this is a plan for a 20-foot by 40-foot barn. She goes, yeah. Then he draws it in half, and he goes, and this is a plan for 2 20-foot by 20-foot barns. She goes, yeah, so what? So, okay, so then he goes on, and he has her take her marks. She writes down all the marks again. And then he does this really interesting thing where he has her take a book she brought. And they start looking at the book, and he goes, oh my God, this book uses a mark that you made. Look at that. It uses a mark that you made. And it's another, there's another mark that you made. Now notice, I think it's really important, he didn't say, you made a mark in the book. The book was using a mark that she made. Interesting, there's a presupposition there. Wow, that's interesting. He spent the whole time finding out how this book was using marks she knew how to make. Then he said, now, everything has a name. Like, this is a horseshoe. He took a horseshoe. Yeah, that has a name. And, this is a stick, and this is this. So everything has a name. So now these marks that she made, since she already knew how to name things, that was easy. She could name things in her kitchen, name objects. So he just wanted to learn how to name the marks. So she learned how to name the marks, A and B. She made names for them. They had her go home and practice that. And the next thing he had her do was to start to put them together, like the barn, the 2 20-foot barns, and all this stuff. So all this stuff she already understood. So he had her start putting these marks next to each other. And he said, now, when you put marks next to each other like this, just like that a chair has a leg and it has a back, and it has a seat, but the whole thing is a chair, you know that this set of marks has the name B and an O and O and a K, but there's also a name for the whole marks together. That's book. So they had her take some marks, and I mean, she already do that. She knew how to name things. So they had her go and take, and she named all these marks. And then the final thing he did was then he had her start writing down some of these things. So he had her like, he wrote down one here, and one here, and one here. And she's having her write all this stuff down. One here, one here, something like that. Then he had her name them all in a row. Like, so it was like, get going, Ma, and get grub, or something. And she said, well, that's what Pa always says to me. Because he just had her, after he had her write them down, not in order, he just had her read them all in a row. Just read all the marks that she'd made. Well, that's just like talking. Well, yeah, you know how to talk. And of course, I think you can see that by that point, she already had all the basic skills. So what he did was real interesting. He built a presupposition. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that you can't already do. Okay, so it has to be, it's put into frames of things. He's not going to teach her how to read. He's not going to teach her anything new. He's going to just teach her how to do things that she can already do. And then he chunked it down into small enough pieces that there was no way that she could not be able to accomplish them. So that would be an example of, here he chunked down over a large piece of time. But that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. A person may not be able to read, but they can make marks, and they can name things, and they can combine marks, and learn the names for combined things. Well, that's all they need. So that's one of the real interesting values of chunking down to get your way around a belief. Chunking up, on the other hand, you can see here as if it goes, well, this house has cost too much of a pile of money. I can say, well, it's not just a house, it's your castle. It's your cave, and it's primal, you know, the caves and, you know, these are always the most important thing for everybody to have. It's here you have a fortress against the outside world. That's not what it is. What is that worth? So by chunking it up to a bigger level issue, it kind of changes your perception of it as well. So I think that becomes a, by making it into something bigger and fit into this bigger class, once again, it changes your perception. So chunking up, instead of going down to doors and windows and trees, it's going to castles and caves and igloos and all these things that are really basic parts of human experience. How much is that worth? Change frame size. What I did over here is, I'm trying to use a little metaphor. One frame, you look at the house and you go, it's too expensive. But if you look at the bigger frame and see the big bad wolf coming, now do you want a house of brick or a house of straw, you know? So, I mean, the change frame size, when you look at here, you go, well, I don't know, this brick house, it looks like a lot of trouble, too much, I mean, it's the Three Little Pigs, right? Too much trouble to make, I want to go out and have fun. But if I see that the big bad wolf is coming, which one do I want? So that's what change frame size is. What do I include in my total picture? Okay? Which is different than chunking up. This is trying to relate it to bigger categories. Counterexample is just, can I find a time when somebody had one part of the belief and not the other? I mean, the belief is a relationship. This causes that. If I can find that this occurs without that, or that occurs without, this occurs without that, then that's a counterexample. Okay? So, what I'd like to do is let's take a couple of beliefs, like, I care too much about people. Let's take the organization one was.
So yeah, I was not organized because
Because you.
I wasn't,
Not interested in it because.
Because I feel that by being
Right.
organized in one here that I will allow my mind to expand to the
Okay, that being organized is a trade-off. So what I can do to chunk down is I can say, when you are creative, what parts are there when you're being creative? How do you create things?
sort of things.
So you organize them in such a way that they can begin to come in the right place? Do they have to come in the right place?
When they come in, I guess I do try them in different ways.
Okay. So one of the things I can do is to say, well, wait a minute, when he talks about being creative, I can chunk down creativity into letting things come in, try them in different ways, finding the ones that work the best. Now guess what I can do? I can say, well, isn't that the same thing you do with organizing? You have to get the information in, you have to try it out in different ways and find the one that works the best. So if I chunk them down, they're both the same thing. So all I have to do is be a creative organizer. And in the same way that you organize your creativity. So that would be a way of chunking it down to actually say, well, if I chunk it into its smaller pieces, it's something that you're actually doing. If I take something like spelling, it's one of the things we do is, I don't want you to spell the word. All I want you to do is see if you can make a picture of it in your mind. Can you do that? Yeah, I can make a picture of it in my mind. Can you read off the letters? Yeah. Well, that's not spelling. That's making a picture of it in your mind and reading off the letters. You've chunked it down into two elements that are not so difficult as spelling. If we chunk this up, where we said, well, I can't trade off, there's a trade-off between being creative and organizing. I would chunk organization up to something like, I could say, well, if your experience doesn't have a structure, how can you possibly function in the world? So what I'm doing is I'm taking the term organization and I'm chunking it up and saying, what is organization? In the biggest frame, it's structuring of experiences. Well, it doesn't have the same implications. So is it really such a trade-off to be able to find the most appropriate ways to structure your experiences? Yes. So again, you might want to check out your own responses to that. Let's take a bigger frame size. If I go to bigger frame size, I can say, well, if you don't learn to organize now, if you don't get that done now, then you might have too many pieces out there that are going to come back and get you in the future. So if you just keep letting it go into that disarray, then it might stop you from ever being able to be creative because you're going to be spending so much time picking up the pieces. So that's change frame size. I put it into a longer time frame. Or now the counterexample is fairly easy. I can say, was there ever a time that you were able to be organized and creative at the same time? So they don't necessarily go as a trade-off to each other. Is it possible for you to even be creative without being organized? Would you be creative if you couldn't organize the information after it came in? Could you?
No, I see what you mean.
Yeah. So first of all, the structure of what I'm doing is, what I'm wanting you to do is to be thinking about it from literally different perspectives. So I say, well, the kind of thing I was working on here is creativity means I can't be organized. There's a trade-off between the two. So what I can do is say, well, wait a minute, let me find an example that doesn't fit this belief. There have been times when you've probably been able to be creative and organized at the same time. In fact, I could say the most important, the people that are the biggest geniuses that I know are the ones that are the most organized about their creativity. So again, I can go to a counterexample that this is not necessarily so as a relationship. I'm going to chunk our time down here. Let me take a minute. I want to find out how you're doing. Like I said, in doing the sleight of mouth, because these are categories and strategies that I personally think are really powerful and can open up a lot of things for you, I want to make sure that we spend the time for you to get a quality learning of them. Let me also find out, with all these various things that we've been doing so far, where are you at with them? Someone was saying, well, I kind of lost it around the chunk down, so on and so forth. What are the areas, if you kind of take a moment and look back at the whole day so far, where we've done redefining, we've done consequences, we've chunking down, chunking up, change of frame size, counterexample. Where are the clear spots and the foggy spots?
It was all clear.
It's all clear until I drew the pictures.
That's not how the pictures help.
Okay, good. That's
It
easy.
was real clear up until when we started talking about chunk down, chunk up.
Okay, so chunk down, chunk up. How about everybody else? Was it chunk down, chunk?
Clarity on consequences.
Consequences is something that you like.
I'd like more on intent.
On intention. Okay. Let me ask you for this then. Here's what I'd like you to do tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'd like to come in and do just some demonstrations of taking beliefs. And what I'll do is, I know someone else brought up a very important issue where he said, well, in going over the examples, and I think this is very important for everybody, is said I kind of wasn't easy for me to put myself in the position of saying those things and feel like it was realistic to me. In other words, some of it seemed maybe too harsh. As it was like an identity thing. I don't know if I'd want to let that into my identity. And I do believe that these things can be done in a way that is very positive and validating, and it doesn't have to be, I mean, in a sense here, I'm not trying to challenge you and say this thing isn't wrong. We're kind of, that this organization thing is wrong. We're kind of trying to come at it from different angles and say, well, what happens if you think of it this way? And open up some space in there. Also, as we begin to put them together in a format where you can sort of see, well, how do they function together organically as opposed to this pattern to this and that pattern to that, I think that that's going to be kind of important. So I'd like to ask you, if you would tonight, to think of what is some kind of a belief that you would like to see how this works with. And it could be a challenging belief. It could be one of your own. It could be one that you deal with that is a very common one that comes up all the time in your work. Another thing you can do is to maybe look at the newspapers. See if you can find beliefs or interesting things that are happening. I remember I found a lot of this kind of stuff going on at the Ollie North trial. You know, Mr. North, didn't you act without integrity? I was only trying to save people's lives. Didn't act without integrity to protect people that needed protection. Well, were you trying to protect other people, or were you just trying to cover your own ass? Well, in other words, the reason that the thing was going on primarily in that, what would you call it? That it's not a trial, but in that inquiry, whatever, is sleight of mouth. If he could justify what he did, if he could put it in the right frame, it made him look good. And they were trying to make it look bad. They could chunk up. Well, Mr. North, if everybody did the kind of things that you were doing, what kind of a government structure would we have? So chunk it up, generalize it to bigger frames and that kind of thing. And I think one of the things you're going to find is that another strategy, at least I'd like you to consider, is finding where it does occur naturally. Because I will claim that what made Oliver North successful was an intuitive use of sleight of mouth. I was over in Europe. There was an interesting thing going on with the Barbie trial. The Klaus Barbie, the Nazi that they were having on trial. And it was like, well, is Barbie on trial, or is the French judicial system on trial? Are you going to chunk up, or are you going to chunk down? What if we treated everybody in the way that we're treating this person? Yes, but look at what he did in the past to all those people. What kind of justice are we going to have? All these different frames. The reality of it shifts depending upon the frame that you use. And I think that one of the things I'm suggesting is find out. People use this all the time. Talking about jokes, so to speak. How do you use sleight of mouth in it? Okay, we're changing frame size here going. We look at what we're doing in the larger scope of time. They're trying to lock the doors, so. But I'd like you to consider how jokes use sleight of mouth. Part of what happens is you change the frame size on something, it looks funny in that context. So, tomorrow morning, first thing, what I will do is to show how to organically put some of these things together in a piece, the ones that we've covered so far, and then we'll move on into some of your own doing exercises. So bring in some challenges for me. I get good when I get challenged. When we start getting some things going, I like to have a little bit of action happening here. So, and if I can't do it, then it's only an indication of where we might go to refine it. So, anyway, good night. Thank you. Thank you. That's sweet.